Welcome to another study in the book of Isaiah. I'll ask, if you will, to please be turning to Isaiah chapter 27 as we wrap up another division that we've been looking at the book. In our last study, we were looking at chapter 26. Chapter 25 and chapter 26 were both songs of praise. Chapter 25 carried the idea of the judgment, or chapter 24 carried the idea of the judgment of the world. Chapter 25 was a song of praise to God for salvation. Chapter 26 was a song of trust in God's protection. And we saw four divisions under that. They were portrayed as residents in God's strong city in verses 1 through 6. The path of righteousness was portrayed in verses 7 through 10. God leads to victory is the message of verses 11 through 19. And then we saw judgment was coming. Verses 20 and 21 of chapter 26. And that serves pretty much as a segue here into chapter 27, which is going to be about punishment and deliverance. Now, excuse me, just a couple of words of warning here. When we look at the concept of punishment and reverence or deliverance, and we see judgment being portrayed, let's remember here that in this chapter there's no specifics. In other words, it's going to be somewhat difficult to look at a particular point in history and see what's being discussed here, as that's not his purpose. We do see that purpose elsewhere. We see specific countries and burdens against them. We saw Israel and Judah, God's people, with a judgment against them. We saw it referring to captivity. We saw a blessing for God's people coming back out of captivity. And in those sections, we do see pegs, or we see something in the context that shows us the detail. Chapter 27 is minus those details. And so therefore we have a very general picture of punishment and a very general picture of deliverance that is seen. Can we see punishment as captivity? Yes, we can. Can we see deliverance in the form of the remnant coming back into the land? Yes, we can, but these are not specific prophecies of those things. So we can see several different applications. As a matter of fact, we're going to see a messianic application here. We're going to see application in the church regarding this deliverance, or at least we see a precursor pointing us to that. And so a point that I'll address again when we get toward the end of this chapter, move into another section beginning in chapter 28. We're going to see here in this chapter another example of the prophetic perfect. That is a rhetorical device that the prophets used to speak of something in the future as if it were already occurring, already happening. And when we see that being done, we see attention being drawn to the certainty, the assurance, the confidence, the trust that we are to have in that prophecy, because it is so sure in fulfillment that it's already being spoken of as having occurred. Again, we use chapter 53 as a powerful example of that, and we'll note that again when we get there. So here in this chapter, we see a description both of the punishment of evil and the restoration of true worship to God by his people. Again, rather than focusing on specifics, here Isaiah referred to a general judgment, and as it relates to restoration, an overall spiritual restoration. So rather than pinpointing this and saying this only refers to the captivity, God's people being delivered out of that captivity and the remnant's return, does this include that? I believe it does, but this is not a prophecy of that in particular. It's general statements with general fulfillment. And I think that'll help us as we move through. So let's look at chapter 27, verse 1, and let's look at punishment and deliverance. As a matter of fact, chapter 27, verse 1, this could be an unfortunate chapter break. This very much goes in with what we saw verses 20 and 21 of chapter 26 being a segue into this chapter. We could very well see a chapter break. The chapter could very well be seen as beginning in chapter 27, verse 2. But let's leave it as it is. In that day, the Lord with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. So here God is subduing his enemy. We're told in that day that God will punish Leviathan. Now, the phrase in that day is encapsulating what we saw in this entire section, verses 24 through, chapter 24 through chapter 27. This day refers to a sense of judgment. And here it reaches a climax in this chapter. Again, think about a book, a great beginning. We find the theme of the book, and then we see the conclusion where we see a climax being reached. That's what we see if we see these 5 chapters, 24, 25, 26, 27, as a unit coming to a close. Because when we get into chapter 28, we're getting back into a sense of burdens again. I believe it's chapter 28, through chapter 33. We're going to see that. So when we look at this, let's throw chronology out the window. Chronology is not that important as it relates to Isaiah. That was not his purpose, was to start in chapter 1 and go through chapter 66 in a chronological order. He's dealing with groups of thoughts. He's dealing with chapters that are grouped together to form a book or a thought. And we're concluding one of those here with this sense of judgment. Now, hopefully, you've seen a word that it lies at the heart of a lot of discussion and a lot of debate as it relates to this verse, and that is Leviathan. Who or what is the Leviathan in this chapter? The word Leviathan occurs 6 times in the Old Testament. And as is always the case, we need to allow the context, to determine what we're talking about here. Leviathan is a transliteration of a Hebrew word. In other words, it's not an English word. It's a Hebrew word that was kind of turned into an English word. That's what the word baptizo is in the Greek. We see transliterations occur on more than one occasion. Here it's a name, and it's a transliteration of a Hebrew term that is defined as serpent or sea monster. Many times when I think of Leviathan, I think of the myth, the legend of the Loch Ness Monster. Something that was seen, a creature, a serpent-like creature that is in the sea. I believe that's what we see back in the book of Job. And as a matter of fact, I believe Job is referring to an actual creature there, and God asking him if he could fish Leviathan out with a hook. So you're looking at a creature that likely doesn't exist anymore. But we're looking at something that did exist, and it was something that a word that was used to teach lessons and to characterize something. Some say it's merely a mythological creature, again, like the Loch Ness Monster. But, even with a myth, a lot of times those are based on something that people think they saw, and they try to explain it. We see Bigfoot, Sasquatch. We see Chupacabra, South Texas, Mexico. We see this sea creature, dragons, serpents, fire-breathing creatures. And so we're looking at something that very well could exist, but it grows into something else. Again, Sasquatch. I don't know what the original person saw. I believe they saw something, and then they tried to build something to it. Chupacabra sounds some kind of a vicious dog type creature. But we see those throughout. Now, some simply want to dismiss Leviathan here as one of these myths, but the Old Testament doesn't always treat it in that fashion. Other people believe it refers to some kind of dinosaur, and I believe that's the case in what we see with the book of Job. The book of Job, as it relates to the patriarchal system, remember Job is offering sacrifices on behalf of his family. He refers to a creature that they recognized. And if you're looking at dinosaurs, you're looking at the flood eventually brought about the end of all of those. But you're looking at a point in time when something was addressed that people would have a memory. They would know what's being discussed here. We're far removed from that. I don't believe we have anything like that today. But they did in this day, and it meant something to them at that point. That it refers to a real creature, again, is seen there in the book of Job. And there's no reason to see it differently here. Do they still exist in the time of Isaiah? No, I don't believe they do. But they would remember. And something is being characterized here by this real creature. The idea being represented here is that Leviathan stands for all kinds of enemies that are going to be defeated by God. Whether they're in the heights, whether they're in the depths of the sea, every enemy is going to come down. Every enemy is going to be destroyed. They're all going to suffer the punishment of God. Judgment is coming on all of them. Now remember, when we get back into those other chapters, we saw burdens against all of these countries that were going to come down. Here again, you have a very general reiteration of the judgment that's being spoken of in those other places. Isaiah is going to have more to say about them in coming chapters and in coming collections of chapters. But here we see a very general conclusion being drawn at the end of this section of these songs of praise and messages of judgment, that everybody is going to fall. Then in verses 2 through 6, we see the section that we'll just simply refer to as the vineyard of the Lord. In that day sing to her, a vineyard of red wine. I, the Lord, keep it. I water it every moment, lest any hurt it. I keep it night and day. Fury is not in me. Who would set briars and thorns against me in battle? I would go through them. I would burn them together. Or let him take hold of my strength, that he may make peace with me, and he shall make peace with me. Those who come he shall cause to take root in Jacob. Israel shall blossom and bud, and fill the face of the world with fruit. If you remember all the way back to Isaiah chapter 5, God used this imagery of a vineyard. And there in chapter 5, it was a very negative connotation in which vineyard was used. There you have Israel being pictured as an unproductive vineyard. Israel's unfaithfulness is obviously the topic of discussion in that section. But now here it's much more positive. In a positive note in the wording of this song, remember the song continues. We're looking at a collection of different aspects of songs, and here is a song that's depicting the sense of judgment. Just as the farmer would faithfully protect his vineyard, he would cultivate it, he would plant seed, he would take care of the weeds. In other words, he would care for it, he would tend it, and then he would expect a harvest from that. Here you have God being depicted as tending that garden. It's a beautiful vineyard, a beautiful garden with God as the tender or the keeper. Just as the farmer would faithfully protect that crop, remember his livelihood depended upon that crop. So just as he would take care of it, that imagery now is shifting over to God, using his people as the vineyard and God as the tender or the keeper, faithfully protecting his people. As we think about God's plan to redeem, as we think about the remnant coming back into the land, remember that God chose Israel. That language is used in many places. And one of the senses in which he chose Israel or Judah or God's people, depending upon what word is used to depict them in a given context, something is still to be completed. Do we want to see the return from captivity in this song, in this section? Yes, and I believe we can. But there's also something greater coming down the road in the sense of what the Messiah is going to do. God is going to be working through Judah. When the people come back into the land, the three post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, zero in on Messiah who is to come, because the seed promise is not fulfilled yet. God still has plans for his people. One from Judah is still going to ascend to the throne. Genesis 49:10, 2 Samuel 7, as we've mentioned in so many places. So in a sense, God's wrath against his people is finished. When you look at captivity, that was a sense of wrath. Both Israel and Judah were carried away into Assyrian and Babylonian captivity in sequence. But now Cyrus is going to arise, and he's going to sign a decree to bring the people back. You're going to have this restoration of God's people. They're going to worship again. The temple's going to be rebuilt. But let's not remove what's going to happen in the first century, because God's people now is going to be expanded to Jew and Gentile. And Jew and Gentile are going to be portrayed as worshiping God from Mount Zion. And then later on, it's not going to be on that mountain. We're going to see a very general sense of worship. So we're seeing a progression here. We're seeing something that can be fulfilled now, but something later, and not in the sense of a specific prophecy, but of a general prophecy in which we can see some sense of fulfillment in other situations and in other places. Now, when God decides to bring the remnant back, looking at an initial fulfillment of this thought, the people are going to be protected from God's enemies. Notice again, who would set briars and thorns against me in battle? God's going to protect his people. He's going to be with his people. And let's also remember, this is not a new promise. When Joshua led the people into the conquest, God had promised them that if they would stay faithful, that God would fight their battles and they would be successful. When we look at the alliances that were sought very early here in Isaiah, they went against that promise. They forgot that promise. When we move into chapter 28, we're going to see these sense of alliances again. God's not through discussing the alliances because they're going to continue to pop up. And he's showing the consequences of those things. God would stop these enemies and he would burn them completely. What about a messianic fulfillment of this? The Jews did not stop God's plan. The grave did not stop God's plan. Christ was born as prophesied, Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. In the fullness of the time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law. We see the fulfillment. We see all these prophecies starting out wide, and we see them coming down in such fulfillment. This is why when I'm teaching the book of Acts, chapter 2 gets so much attention, because there are so many passages, so many thoughts, so many doctrinal issues that come to a head right there in that chapter. And we're amazed by seeing the fulfillment of all of those things. I hope that you will continue to generate an excitement for the study of God's Word and an excitement in studying these prophecies and seeing their fulfillment and having our faith continue to grow from seeing how God worked through all of these points. When God makes promises and we see them fulfilled, it is such a faith-building essence. What's going to be the result of this vineyard? God is tending this vineyard, and there is going to be a fruitful result. Now remember, back in chapter 5, he expected the fruitful result, but it didn't come. What was anticipated did not happen because of a lack of faith. Here, the people are called upon to have great faith because God is going to produce fruit from them. And yes, we move right on into the first century again, and we see the rapid growth of the church as a full end of what we see here, of what God provided, what God tends, and the fruit that comes from a faithful response. Clyde M. Wood, in his commentary, said this inspired expectation stands fulfilled in the worldwide spread of Israel's true spiritual influence through the proclamation of the saving gospel of Christ. This message of hope, this care, the promises given to them here are going to culminate in what we see. When we look at Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and we see that first messianic prophecy of this seed, when we look to Abraham's promises and the seed promise that's given to him, we fast forward through time, looking through all of these Old Testament books, as we see point after point after point that leads us to that grand conclusion: Christ is sitting on the throne. The gospel has been made complete with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and the faithful proclamation of that gospel results in fruit throughout the first century. Book of Acts, 3,000 were baptized. We move into chapter 3, there's 5,000 men. We look at the missionary journeys and we see one congregation after another being established. We see the fruit of God's word when it's applied faithfully by the messengers that God selected for that to occur. Now, God's people in verses 7 through 11 are being depicted as being cleansed through chastisement. Has he struck Israel as he struck those who struck him? Or has he been slain according to the slaughter of those who were slain by him? In measure, by sending it away, you contended with it. He removes it by his rough wind in the day of the east wind. Therefore, by this the iniquity of Jacob will be covered, and this is all the fruit of taking away his sin, when he makes all the stones of the altar like chalk stones that are beaten to dust. Wooden images and incense altars shall not stand. Yet the fortified city will be desolate, the habitation forsaken and left like a wilderness. There the calf will feed, and there it will lie down and consume its branches. When its boughs are withered, they will be broken off. The women come and set them on fire. For it is a people of no understanding. Therefore he who made them will not have mercy on them, and he who formed them will show them no favor. Chastisement is a form of instructive discipline. Isaiah indicated that it was necessary for wickedness to be cleansed from the land. If we look at Judah, Israel being carried away into captivity, it was necessary for that to occur. There was sin in the land that had to be dealt with, and that chastisement did that. Even when we think of church discipline today, if you move fast forward in time to 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and you look at a young man who was sleeping with his stepmother, the idea there was much more than just getting rid of a cancer, getting rid of a sin. Because when you look at chapter 2, the young man had repented after having been withdrawn from, and now the church was to bring him back in and to encourage him as a brother. That sin had been dealt with. It had been taken away. It had been cleansed. And the end result of that was a better Christian. Here we're looking at a better people, a renewed focus. You see, the people had forgotten God. The people had forgotten the promises of God. And now with just chastisement and return, we're going to see that being brought back. God's people were disciplined by being expelled from the land. The full measure of punishment fell on those who sinned against God. You see, they failed to grasp the holiness of God, and that was one of the primary reasons that he withdrew his compassion and his graciousness. They had to relearn that, and it was through chastisement that it was going to occur. Now, verses 12 and 13 as we close. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will thresh from the channel of the river to the brook of Egypt, and you will be gathered one by one, O you children of Israel. So it shall be in that day the great trumpet will be blown. They will come who are about to perish in the land of Assyria, and they who are outcast in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mount at Jerusalem. The Euphrates and the brook of Egypt mark the boundaries of the land that was prophesied to Abraham. It's found in Genesis chapter 15, verse 18. The brook of Egypt is also referred to sometimes as the river of Egypt. If you look at the maps at the back of your Bibles, sometimes you can look down and write, if you find the Nile River Delta, and go up just a little bit on the land, you'll see this river of Egypt. That's not the Nile. And sometimes people mistake it for the Nile and see that's what's being addressed with the river of Egypt. It's a wadi, W-A-D-I. And a wadi is kind of like a riverbed or a creek bed or a brook that doesn't have water in it all the time. It's seasonal. When the seasonal rains come, you'll find that. Think about some of the creeks that you might have right around your home. Sometimes you drive over a little bridge and you see that that creek bed is dry. But then after a big rain, you see that it begins to flow again for a little while. That's kind of what this brook of Egypt was like. But the mention here is not about the river per se. It's simply referring to them as boundaries. They're coming back into the land that God had promised Abraham, is what's being addressed. Again, just as a farmer carefully gathered the grain after the threshing, God is going to bring his people back. Now again, let's don't fall into seeing this as a specific prophecy that is only fulfilled in the remnant coming back under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. Yes, that is addressed, but it's general enough to include that God is providing for the redemption of all of his people through the blood of Christ and obedience to the gospel message. Verse 13, a great trumpet will be blown. That was to announce something or to signal something. When Christ comes back, we're going to see the trumpets will sound, and we'll look up and we'll see Jesus in the cloud. That's going to signal initially, again, the return from captivity. Remember, that's not going to occur until about 536, long after Isaiah is gone. Isaiah is prophesying about that almost 200 years before it occurs. Now, that trumpet was used to signal the year of Jubilee. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 9 to 13. Numbers chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. The trumpet was designed to signal all assemblies, and that's what's being depicted here, is the remnant is going to be brought back together there in the land. And then by extension, we're going to see the lost, those needing to be saved, are going to be brought together in the church. And we're going to see that trumpet that is going to signal that assembly coming back together, very figurative in nature. It's God's promise here through Cyrus that it's going to be done. But in the first century, it's going to be God's promise, the ultimate promise that's going to come through Christ. And we're going to see that signaling of that one coming. Haley said this: the sounding of this trumpet might be both a call to assemble on the mountain for worship and an announcement that atonement for sin has been perfectly provided in the sacrifice to which the law points. You see, they see both specific and general in nature. Both Clyde Woods and Homer Haley in their commentaries made that depiction. Now, last few words. We only have a minute or so. The dominant theme of chapters 24 through 27 is the coming day of the Lord. Both the immediate judgment of his people Judah and that of the world are depicted in these 4 chapters. But this is a prelude to the emergence of the new Israel that is comprised of both Jews and Gentiles who would join together. Keep in mind, Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman at the well, the 2 mountains upon which worship was done. John 4:24 called for a new sense of worship. It's not going to be on this mountain. It's going to be the new Israel. We're seeing the church being prophesied of here. This is a prelude to the emergence of the new Israel comprised of both Jews and Gentiles who would join together to worship on Mount Zion. And so here again, we have another example of that prophetic perfect. Okay, we'll stop right here. Our time is up. Next time, we're going to look at the book of Woes. That's chapters 28 through 33. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us again in our next session. And until then, God bless you.